Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the information you share with us and really unpack it.
Exactly. We cut through the noise, get to the core insights from your sources,
Think of us as your guides, helping you make sense of it all.
making it digestible.
So today, we're diving into an opinion piece from Unheard. It's titled, Pride is No Place for Homosexuals.
It's one author's take, their perspective on how Pride Month has evolved and, related issues in the wider LGBT community.
And just to be clear, our mission here is really to explore the specific points this author makes in this particular text.
Yeah, we're not endorsing it, just extracting the arguments they present, looking at their specific lens.
Okay, let's get into it then. The author kicks off pretty strongly, saying that today's pride feels overblown and excessive compared to how it used to be.
It's quite a statement to start with, sets a definite tone.
Definitely. And they talk about how they personally sort of vent this frustration. They set up something called the Viner Award.
Right, the Viner Award. They frame it as a kind of golden raspberry for corporate wokery.
Like the awards for bad movies, but for companies during Pride Month.
Exactly. Given out via a Twitter poll, apparently, to the company or institution that, and this is their phrase, most beclowns itself in the season of alphabet sanctimony.
Strong words. And they give examples, don't they, to show what they mean.
They do. Specific contenders from previous years. It helps illustrate the kind of thing they're critiquing.
Like a Halifax bank telling customers, close your accounts if you don't like staff pronoun badges.
Yeah, that one caused quite a stir at the time.
Or they mention the Natural History Museum. Something about likening homosexuals to self-cloning lizards, which sounds odd.
The author certainly presents it as problematic, yeah. Part of what they see is unhelpful or even regressive messaging.
And last year's winner, according to the article, was Nottingham City Council.
For banning the lesbian activist, Julie Bindel.
Because she was going to speak about violence against women, but the council objected to her views on whether humans can change sex, even though, as the author points out, that wasn't the topic of her talk.
Right, so these examples are used by the author to really hammer home their point about what feels to them overblown or worthy of that sort of mock award today.
It builds their case for this feeling of excess.
It does. And then they pivot to contrast this with the past, how they remember Pride. They call it a riot.
A riot, not just a party.
Well, yeah, in the sense of protest, I think. A day to remember the wins since Stonewall, but also to shout about the rights still needed. Very political.
They mentioned working at a London paper, Capital Gay, back in the 90s.
Yeah, and a colleague apparently said Pride was all our birthdays and Christmases rolled into one. A big deal.
But crucially, the author stresses it was one day.
Exactly. Not what they call a bloated month of pink-washed flummery, of reimagined company logos, empty sloganeering, and corporate parade float sponsorship.
Pink-washed flummery, this isn't quite the phrase, really captures their view of the commercialization.
It absolutely does. It underlines that shift they perceive, from grassroots activism to something more corporate and, in their eyes, maybe a bit superficial.
More style than substance, perhaps, in their view?
That seems to be the implication. They paint the past as much more raw, politically charged.
And they give a concrete example, London Pride, June 1995.
Right. A march of 75,000 people, lesbians and gay men, and then a party afterwards with 200,000 people. Huge numbers.
Wow. That does sound massive and vital.
And the context they give for 95 is really important for understanding why they felt Pride was so necessary then.
What was the context?
Well, they were still fighting for basic equality. Just the year before, 94, MPs had lowered the age of consent for gay men.
Okay, progress.
Sort of, but only from 21 down to 18. They rejected lowering it to 16, which was the age for heterosexuals.
Ah, so still unequal.
Exactly. And the author says that decision really reinforced their status as second-class citizens.
I see. So gathering together like that, it wasn't just a celebration.
No, not at all. The author calls it a refuge, a powerful word, a space where, just for that day maybe, they could feel they had just as much right as anyone else to be ourselves.
A necessary refuge.
That's the argument. And this is where the author really connects the past to their critique of the present.
How so?
They argue that that kind of refuge, that specific need for a space just to exist openly without feeling like a second-class citizen, isn't there anymore.
Because things have improved.
In their view, yes. They say, life no longer treats us so cruelly. And that's why current pride feels excessive to them. The external pressure that created the need for that specific kind of refuge has eased off from their perspective.
So the purpose has changed or maybe disappeared in their eyes.
That seems to be the core of it. Since legal equality for gay and lesbian people is largely achieved, at least in the UK where the author is based, the original driving force isn't felt as acutely by them.
Interesting point. They also talk about a kind of cultural cringe with modern media portrayals.
Yes, they do. They point specifically to a BBC reality show, I Kissed a Boy.
Okay, what's their issue with it?
They feel the portrayal, what they call the hand-flapping and Yas Queen Campery, feels like a throwback
A throwback to what?
to what they term regressive stereotypes from 70s TV. They mention figures like Larry Grayson and John Inman.
So they see it as reinforcing old stereotypes rather than challenging them.
That's the argument. And they highlight what they see as an irony there,
Which is?
that a generation seemingly focused on reinventing gender norms is, in their opinion, falling back on these quite dated stereotypical portrayals. Taking such ready refuge in regressive stereotypes is how they put it.
It's a sharp critique, and they extend it to fashion, too.
Yeah, calling some portrayals a circus freak show. They specifically mention a Calvin Klein campaign.
What was the issue there?
It featured a model described as a bearded, hairy-chested, plus-sized female model. The author contrasts this with older campaigns like Mark Wahlberg's, implying a significant shift they find, well, not positive.
So all this critique builds up to a question, really. How did we get here?
Exactly. The author tries to trace that path. They look back about a decade ago.
To when?
To the period just after major legal victories, like the dismantling of discriminatory laws and the legalization of same-sex marriage in the UK.
A time of optimism, perhaps?
It sounds like it for the author. They recall feeling we had achieved everything we'd asked for. There was a sense, they write, that prejudice seemed to fall away.
So what happened next in their narrative?
Well, they describe having what they now see as a naive idea.
Naive how?
They envisioned moving towards a sort of truth and reconciliation model.
Yeah.
Being, magnanimous to former opponents, and crucially, shifting the focus.
Just shifting it where?
Towards international issues,
Right.
really serious human rights crises facing gay and lesbian people elsewhere.
Right, you mentioned some earlier.
Yes. The author cites examples like young gay men being hanged in Iran, the horrific corrective rape of lesbians in Cameroon, or challenging those old colonial-era anti-gay laws still on the books in some Commonwealth countries.
Stuff that definitely still needs urgent attention.
Absolutely. And the author felt that should have become the main focus after achieving legal equality at home.
But they argue it didn't happen that way.
No. And they offer a rather, cynical take on why not.
Which is?
Basically, that the infrastructure of activism needs issues. Charities need problems to address, lobbyists need grievances, media publishers need to grow their demographic, that kind of thing.
Implying the focus stayed domestic partly for institutional reasons.
That's the suggestion.
Yeah.
And they point specifically to the lobby group Stonewall.
What about Stonewall?
According to the author, Stonewall expanded its mission in 2015. It started campaigning on trans issues alongside LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bisexual issues.
And the author sees this as significant.
Very. Based on their own experience covering the gay rights movement as a journalist for 2 decades, they argue that up until that point, the trans movement was, in their words, entirely separate, both culturally and politically.
They'd never encountered trans campaigners in their work before then.
They state that explicitly, yes. Over 20 years of reporting on political developments.
So they see 2015 as a pivotal moment.
Yes. They mention the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, which addressed trans rights, but they frame the 2015 Stonewall shift as a sort of merger.
A merger.
That's their term. They suggest that after this point, the rainbow establishment set about pretending that the two camps had already been one, even though, in their view, they hadn't been historically integrated in that way.
And how do they characterize this merged movement?
Quite forcefully, actually. They call it a cuckoo in the nest of the campaign for lesbian and gay rights.
Wow, a cuckoo in the nest. That's a strong image.
It is. And they argue this merger, as they see it, brought a new agenda that was distinct from the traditional LGBT rights focus.
What kind of things?
Demands around redefining language, reorganizing public spaces like toilets and changing rooms, the impact on women's sports, influencing HR departments.
Issues that have become quite contentious.
Extremely. And the author claims that at its most baleful, this new focus led to attempts to root out wrong-thinking heretics.
Heretics, like who?
They give the example of Maya Forstater, the think tank consultant involved in a high-profile employment tribunal case related to her gender-critical views. The author frames this as trying to silence dissent from every walk of life.
So a pretty critical view of how things developed after 2015.
Very critical.
Mm-hmm.
But then, interestingly, the article shifts tone slightly near the end.
Oh, so.
The author argues that more recently, it feels like the tide is turning against some of these trends they've been outlining.
Okay, a potential shift back. What evidence do they offer?
Several specific examples from recent news cycles, things they see as indicators.
Such as?
Well, British cycling authorities ruling that male-bodied riders have to compete in their own sex class, not the female class.
Right, that was controversial.
It was. And the author highlights the reaction from a UK trans cyclist, Emily Bridges, who apparently called the policy a violent act furthering genocide. The author uses this reaction to exemplify how disagreement gets framed, in their view.
Okay, what else?
They mentioned news about the women's record in parkrun, the free-timed runs being held by a male-bodied trans runner.
And the implication.
The author suggests this adds to an impression that biological males identifying as women are, quote, snatching prizes unfairly in some contexts, especially where physical advantage is perceived.
Got it. Any other examples of this tide turning?
They mention Baroness Faulkner, the head of the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission, surviving what the author calls a palace coup by trans activist staff members who disagreed with her stance on certain issues.
Implying internal pushback against activism within institutions.
That seems to be the suggestion. Also, they point to philosopher Kathleen Stock speaking at the Oxford Union.
What about it?
The author praises her composure in the face of protest, saying it made her critics look like entitled brats. Again, framing the interaction in a particular way.
Okay. Any non-UK examples?
Yes. They mention an Australian businesswoman, Sal Grover. She was taken to court for creating a female-only social media network.
And the relevance.
The author quotes her saying something like, "It certainly does feel like we're 90 seconds to midnight for everyone admitting the TERFs were right."
Using that term, TERF.
Yes, trans-exclusionary radical feminist.
Yeah.
Often used as a slur. But here, the author presents the quote seemingly as evidence of a growing sentiment aligning with gender-critical views.
And they bring up corporate examples, too.
Right at the end, yeah. Bud Light, Target, Gillette companies, they say, face LGBT backfires.
Suggesting negative business consequences for certain campaigns or policies.
Exactly. The author posits they might become cautionary tales in business schools. So across sports, institutions, public debate, and business, the author sees signs of a potential shift.
Interesting. But where does this leave the bigger picture?
Well, the author then draws a really stark contrast. They juxtapose all this focus on, domestic cultural issues, internal community debates.
Yeah. With what?
With what they argue surely is the stuff that matters.
Which goes back to
Those international human rights crises they mentioned earlier. Uganda bringing in the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. Turkey's President Erdogan campaigning against LGBT people. His minister making vile accusations.
really dangerous situations.
Absolutely horrific. And the author says, this is the stuff we once used to care about, implying the focus has been lost.
So they see a misplaced focus.
Clearly. They contrast the urgency of those situations with what they perceive as a fragile generation, treating polite disagreement as genocide.
That's harsh.
It is. And they worry the community has gained a reputation for, their words again, cry-bully tantrums. It expresses a real disappointment with the current state of affairs as they see it.
And how does the article wrap up?
With a hope, really. A hope that the gender wars will end, as they put it, and the community can get back to what they consider more proportionate values.
Proportionate, presumably meaning that earlier focus on fundamental rights and serious global persecution.
That seems to be the clear implication, yes.
Okay, so summing up, we've unpacked this one specific viewpoint from the Unheard article. The author's personal sense that pride has become excessive, their critique of certain cultural trends, and the merging of TQ+ issues with LGBT issues, and their belief that the focus should be elsewhere.
Exactly. It's a perspective that sets up a strong contrast between their experience of past activism fighting for basic legal equality for homosexuals and the current landscape of pride and broader community activism as they perceive it today. It's one voice, one particular argument, in a very complex, ongoing conversation.
It certainly gives us a lot to think about. And here's a final thought for you, our listeners. Building on that tension the author highlights. How do we, as individuals or communities, weigh the importance of these internal, domestic, cultural debates against the undeniable urgency of fighting severe persecution faced by gay and lesbian people in many parts of the world? Where should the focus lie? Something to mull